Hello, my name is Aubrey Hicks, and I am the Executive Director of the Bedrosian Center on Governance. Welcome to a special research edition of a podcast and our new video series talking about the impact of the research at the Price School. So first, I want to introduce our wonderful panelists on their release of a report called How Do Renters Cope with Unaffordability? And first, I'm going to start with Gary. Gary, you are the director of the Price Center for Social Innovation. Can you tell our listeners what else you do at USC?
Well, I'm a professor in the Price School. This is my 25th year, so I've had a tremendous experience here in the school. Obviously, this has been the most challenging on many dimensions. I also serve as the role of chair of the Department of Public Policy, and I direct the region's Homelessness Policy Research Institute. It's a pleasure to be here with my colleagues and with you today, Aubrey.
Thank you. And Giovanna, you are the PI in this project. Can you introduce yourself and what you're doing now?
Sure. My name is Giovanna Rosen. I'm an assistant professor of public policy at Rutgers. And before I was a postdoc at the Price Center for Social Innovation, and then later a research assistant professor where I got to work with all of my colleagues here. So it's fun to be back, figuratively, if not literally, at USC.
Okay. And then Soledad, could you introduce yourself and tell our listeners and our viewers what you are doing at USC?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Soledad de Gregorio. I'm a postdoc at the Price Center for Social Innovation. I just completed my PhD in public policy and management at the Price School. And I'm working mostly on homelessness and social policy in Los Angeles region and also across the US and other countries.
Thank you. And last but definitely not least, Sean, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, nice to talk with everyone. My name is Sean Angst. I'm a PhD candidate at the Price School in Public Policy and Management, and I am also a researcher at the Center for Social Innovation, and my work focuses on racial justice, community development, and housing, and I'm really excited to be able to collaborate on this project and to talk more about it today. Thanks so much for having us.
Excellent. So before we get too far, Giovanna, could you just do a quick 2-sentence summary of the project, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty.
Sure. So our project launches a survey, a large-scale survey across 2 Los Angeles neighborhoods to understand how people are coping with the high cost of rent in Los Angeles, which is a really pressing issue. And we surveyed in 2019, which gives us a really nice baseline to understand what were conditions like just before the pandemic started.
Excellent. So my first question is that, at the Price School, we've been doing a lot of research in different areas, in real estate and social innovation and all of the different areas that we cover at the Price School. We've been talking about housing affordability. So what is the gap that you're looking to fill with the survey?
Well, I can begin that conversation, Aubrey. For me, I wrote a paper with a former colleague of USC, now he's at UCLA, Stuart Gabriel, which was titled Why Affordability Matters. And that was eventually published in the journal Regional Science and Urban Economics. And our purpose there was to really kind of understand and synthesize the state of knowledge about what we knew about unaffordability and its impact on both individuals and on regions. And so in doing that kind of critical lit review and some additional data analysis, what we uncovered was in many ways what we knew and what we didn't know. And I think what we have learned is clearly that there's a relationship between facing unaffordability and facing higher rent burden, which will define, momentarily the percentage of income that you pay in rent, and individuals, like kids don't do as well in school if their families face unaffordability. People have worse health outcomes. Regions actually grow more slowly if there's more inequality and higher rent burdens on households. All of these factors, though, can be summed up as almost a black box kind of in the sense that we know that these relationships exist, but we don't know actually how people who are facing written burdens cope, and therefore why they would be connected to, inferior outcomes for themselves, their kids, or perhaps even their social networks. And so in my mind, what we needed to do is to actually survey people to understand not just that they make trade-offs, but document what trade-offs might be, both at the household, family, and perhaps social network level, and then to be able to speak to ultimately why we see inferior outcomes for people facing affordability. Then the hope is you could actually focus attention on the right policy levers if you understood the mechanisms that were generating the challenges for families.
So I think you're absolutely right. We should go ahead and define rent burden and its relationship to the larger housing affordability issue.
A household is rent burdened if they spend over 30% of their income on rent, and they're considered severely rent burdened if they pay over 50% of their income on rent. This is a household level measure, so it can disguise a lot of really important nuances across families, across how people live that might otherwise impact their outcomes and their quality of life. But overall, it's been repeatedly upheld to be a really important measure that after the 30% marker, particularly for low-income households, that they start feeling squeezed and start needing to make really impactful trade-offs. We're calling them cutbacks in order to make rent.
So is that 30% what you would call severely rent burdened?
The 30% marker is rent burdened and the 50% marker is severely rent burdened.
Thank you. When we're talking about housing affordability, I think a lot of people are talking about just in particular buying houses, right? But how does rent burden apply to this like why should everyone care? When we talk about housing affordability, why do we care about rent burden?
Well, I think in LA in particular, where the study took place, studying rent burden is especially important because the majority of our population are renters. And so when we're thinking about policy that is going to have wide impact, that can have deep impact in terms of both sort of racial disparities, gender disparities. We know who is, disparately impacted by rent burden as well, falls along those lines. And so not only is it a policy that can have widespread impact, but it can also have impact on particular groups that have been, marginalized in the past, and also can help raise stability for populations that have often been left behind or left out. And so I think it's really important to talk about rent burden, one, because of who it impacts and how widespread it is, and two, that we really think of housing as foundational for accessing a lot of the other resources and rights that are essential to survive, right? Your housing dictates sort of where you go to school, the type of education or employment opportunities you're privy to. It impacts sort of the pollution you're exposed to. And so when we think about affordability, it's about choice, right? And having choice of where you want to live and the types of resources or harms that you're accessing or exposed to. And so I think it's really important for those two reasons in particular.
And just to add some numbers on that, in the two areas we surveyed in Central Los Angeles and in South Los Angeles. And in South Los Angeles, 72% of residents are renters. And in Central Los Angeles, that number rises up to 95%. So it's pretty much the majority of the population in Los Angeles, or at least in these two areas, are renters. So that's another reason why we should really, really care.
I'd say our large overall finding here, and remembering that we surveyed just before the pandemic, right, is that conditions are really difficult for renters before the pandemic, and many were living on the brink, right? Really struggling to get by and already making these deeply impactful cutbacks that we know have short and long-term harm. And as Soledad and Sean mentioned, and Gary alluded to earlier, we should expect these to have significant harms on individuals and households and families, but we should also expect them to have regional harms eventually, right? So we can see the beginning of like a real squeeze. The median household paid nearly 48% of their income on rent. And so we know that leaves them with very little money left over to make their other life, to make the rest of their expenses work, right? That 73% of surveyed households were rent burdened, paying over 30% of their income on rent. 73%. So that's 3 in 4, right? This is not a small phenomenon. This is really prevalent across all renters. As I said, this was before the pandemic, where now we've seen this really large crisis happening around evictions. And so we know that is caused by a lot of the rent burden phenomenon that were happening earlier, but that there's just this real need for intervention.
And I would add that we do see, different outcomes for different groups, sort of that I alluded to. Black and Latinx households are more likely to be rent burdened than white and Asian counterparts. And then I think one finding that's particularly interesting that we noted, though, was that comparing immigrant to non-immigrant households, and those were defined as having everyone in the household have immigrated to the United States versus having at least one person that was born here, because of the differential access, again, to resources, to institutions, to public sort of goods, things like that, and just navigating the different systems and understanding how having someone that was born here that has access to those things, or perhaps that understanding, might allow greater access or greater knowledge of those things. And so interestingly, we did not find a difference between immigrant and non-immigrant households. But one thing that the survey allows us to do, because it is new data, is kind of pull that apart and ask, why that is. And what we found was, when we dug into the demographics of immigrant households, is that they had already made functional adjustments to their lives, whether it's working more, whether it's having more families or more adults in the household, whether it's having smaller units, right, that have less bedrooms. Sort of they've already made these larger adjustments to the way that they are living, their housing, their work. And so that when it came to, essentials like food, like healthcare, it appeared that they were sort of sacrificing or cutting back at around the same level. But again, it seems that way until we pull back and say, actually, there's these larger adjustments that have already been made that allow them to sort of continue at some base level to afford these essentials. Now, I say some base level because, like Giovanna mentioned, we see that a large proportion across the board are already rent burdened. A large proportion of those that are rent burdened are already cutting back. And so we have to ask ourselves, to what degree is this a choice, right? Are people just cutting back to the greatest extent possible in order to survive, in order to just be able to meet those basic necessities? And that's largely sort of what we've seen and captured through this, is that perhaps that choice isn't there, and people are just doing whatever they can, cutting around the margins to just get over that hump, right? To just be able to sort of stay afloat.
So it seems to me that a lot of what you're showing is how connected housing affordability, rent burden is to things like public health and access to opportunity. So let's take a step back and talk about this survey in a little bit depth. So how did you come up with this survey? Who was involved in vetting the questions? And what were you really trying to get at? You had an army of undergrads doing these surveys in both English and Spanish. So this is a really big project. So how did you get started on what you wanted to find out, and what were the appropriate questions?
I'm happy to start with that and speak for all of us here. This was a massive project, and we wanted it to be able to speak with confidence about populations, and that's one reason why it really took so much work to be able to do this well. It really started with a lot of the conversations that we all had as independent researchers, but also through our involvement at the Price Center for Social Innovation, where we're really engaged with conversations with practitioners who we saw a lot of community organizations and residents really starting to organize around issues of housing affordability, even if that wasn't their original goal, that wasn't their original organizational mission. But it was it was the problem that people were facing. And yet not having enough information about how that really impacts their lives. In social science research, we've focused a lot on knowing that affordability matters, on understanding the problems around displacement and trying to measure that, but really not knowing enough about how people are strategizing to stay and how that impacts their lives. And so we saw this gap in our understanding that if we helped bridge that we could really contribute to the conversation and also hopefully help local policy making and practice, which is one of our other goals here. So we started with a series of focus groups, around 40 focus groups across the LA region, to try to understand nuances across geographies and places and just dig in to understand, what are the questions there with more of an inductive research approach, to be able to ask broad questions, right? And we saw so many interesting patterns that we just felt were not studied in the literature, that it really did seem like conditions were very different across immigrant status, that people were turning to their communities and their families in different ways, but that those networks had very different amounts of resources, that people would turn to institutions versus networks very differently. And so we thought that these are really important questions that really matter for how we design policies to support people. And so for that reason, the focus groups, which will be part of Sean's amazing future dissertation, I feel no shame in plugging that, they really motivated us to pursue a survey, which allows us to test those initial findings at a population level. And so that was really the motivation for pursuing a survey, and really inspired us to ask a lot of the questions that we're asking around how are people even building their household, and being able to ask those questions. So I'll stop there, but that's kind of how we got even to why a survey in general.
So Sean, can you tell us a little bit more about the focus groups?
Yeah, absolutely. And just want to shout out first and offer our thanks and appreciation to the community groups that we're able to partner with on that. Lift to Rise in the Coachella Valley. And then here in Los Angeles, we partnered with CD Tech, Community Coalition, Esperanza Community Housing, Trust South LA, Scope, and CD Tech. Hopefully I didn't miss anyone or say anyone 2 or 3 times, but they were all wonderful. And we actually got to sit down with the organizers and admin in each of those organizations and have conversations like Giovanna mentioned to say, what are your constituents brought to you? Whether or not your organization is directly involved in housing, what type of questions are they asking? And what would help you? What questions are you interested in answering? And how might this work help you in sort of pushing for policies or come up with policies that might be helpful, to your members. And so that was really useful because I think it also connected to why we focused on the promise zones that Giovanna alluded to, which is this different way of thinking about policy and the policy creation process. And yes, we are bringing expertise and bringing sort of the power of USC behind us, but how do we meet the community and bring solutions from the ground up? So based on what we've learned, based on what organizers are telling us and the residents are feeding back into that, what clues can that give us about the policymaking process? And I think it's not just about the issues, but it's also about the support, the resistance that's already taking place, right? What infrastructure is already there the community is using to support one another, to get food, to make healthcare happen, to share what they do have? And how can we support those things already in place, those things that already have roots, rather than sort of helicoptering in solutions? And so I think that was powerful with starting with the focus groups, having these more nuanced and deeper conversations with both residents and organizers, and then extrapolating that out to a survey, but always keeping in mind that sort of we wanted the residents' voice to be first and foremost, and thinking through how what we found can lead to sort of policy focused on what's already happening on the ground, or to support what's happening on the ground.
Gary, and if I could add one more,
yes,
community organization was Price Philanthropies in City Heights, and we developed a report that's available on the Price Center website based on those focus groups if people are interested in checking out some of the original findings that inspired this work.
That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing. Gary, can you tell us a little bit more about why social innovation is really taking an interest in community knowledge in when you're building projects?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we can all appreciate that we face a variety of intractable problems in society. And one is this increasing housing instability, precarity, rent burden. These numbers have been marching up steadily here in LA over the last 15 years. We're now just in LA County broadly, we're at almost 30% of the population who are paying more, or the renter population paying more than half their income as rent. And in these areas in particular, you heard the numbers where it's close to 50%. And so when you have an intractable problem, business as usual is not probably going to generate innovation. And so I think what we see in innovation processes writ large in a variety of spaces, both private sector spaces, but certainly in this context, social spaces, is that you have to shift where ideas are generated from, and you need to create a process that actually is going to make sure that those who are generating the idea, the community knowledge, which has often been missing in public policy processes, that they're also part of the process of providing insight and evaluation as you move from steps of understanding what the problem might be at its core, to co-designing solutions, to piloting those solutions, and kind of pivoting forward and scaling when you have something that actually has started to prove to be effective. And I think where this project absolutely fits so at its core is to say, okay, well, how are we going to effectively co-produce a new path forward? And in order to do that, you actually need to understand fundamentally what is going on, and therefore hear from the people who are facing this rent burden as equal contributors to the knowledge that people who have degrees or future degrees and so forth have from reading, vast literatures. And I think that, in many ways, what has been, I think, it's both challenging but also inspiring, is that we've been able to build at the Price Center for Social Innovation, partnerships with, in this context, the 2 Los Angeles Promise Zones, where we've kind of come alongside them. And while we have a formal responsibility that we will be partners in evaluation, but I think it quickly came as we wanted to be partners at multiple levels. And so when people actually said, we want change in this area, and both of the Promise Zones have organized around issues of housing instability, stretching all the way from homelessness to just, people who are earning median income barely able to stay in their houses, and perhaps only have 1 month reserve, if that. And that's what in part the survey kind of showed, is that we want to then come up with solutions that are going to resonate with the community. And so if you really care about innovation and change, then you actually need to bring in knowledge from places that weren't traditionally given the same authority within our systems of power. And so that's, for us as a kind of in the field of social innovation, looking at these problems, certainly they have implications far and beyond social innovation. But they're essential to having an authentic process of social innovation. And so that's, in many ways, and we'll talk, I'm sure, about this, where do we go from here? But I think this is, a critical foundational step to being able to take that. And as my colleagues shared, you can see that in part, one of the things that we were able to do is to provide some structure around the generation of knowledge that will, be able to speak at a higher, more general level than just simply the initial context of Los Angeles. The reason that we had formal focus groups to inform the structure of the survey was so that we would have a survey that actually could uncover truths that are relevant here in LA, but also relevant more generally in terms of populations that are facing these challenges. The reason that we did a systematic survey where we randomized the houses and neighborhoods that we were going to actually speak to is so that we could actually have, the kind of knowledge that's not biased by sample selection issues or those kinds of things, so that we could, in partnership, authentic partnership with the community groups that we're with, they can then point to and say, okay, this is not knowledge just based on, some process that could be biased in some way, but instead it was informed and built around that. And we could put, with some of the tools that we have in the academy, structures that then uplift that voice in a way that is obviously quite important as a university. And so I think it's in those spaces, university partners have often not navigated them as well as we ought to be quite frank. At the same time, this project, is probably not necessarily the model yet, but we are deeply committed to helping to learn from and help to generate, new processes of innovation that really do depend on the expertise of people in the community who are facing these problems, that they can be, equal contributors to those solutions.
I think, Gary, you did a really great summary of why it's really important. But I really want to get across the scope of this project. How many undergrads did you have? What was training like? I have all these questions. So you do your 40 focus groups. That seems like a lot of work. How long did that process take? And then how long from there till you developed the final survey?
So I'll just talk a little bit about the focus groups, and then maybe Soledad or Sean would want to talk a little bit more about the survey. The focus groups were a massive undertaking, just in terms of developing the protocol, but also I think we ended up holding the focus groups in 8 different languages. So just the logistics of running a fieldwork project like this are massive. Finding and training undergrads who are committed to learning how to do this work well, and who are bilingual at the very least. In City Heights, we conducted them, I think, in 6 more languages. And so we had, the logistics of working with translators and all of that. Coming up, as Sean has spoken to and Gary alluded to, coming up with a protocol that we felt was actually reflecting what we were hearing from residents. And then that process of Sean really working with community organizations to say, is this kind of what you're looking for? Is this information that would be helpful? So designing that protocol, then the logistics of running those focus groups, driving around the greater LA region, bringing teams of undergrads or of master's students to help us run them, analyzing the data, coding them, and then putting out reports. And unfortunately, there are some real asymmetries between the rigors and time that it takes to do academic work, and then the real pressures and demands of practitioners on the ground saying, like, we're organizing daily. And so that, I think, was an overarching goal of trying to do this quickly, and then build towards that survey, which we know was always going to be the end goal, because it helps deliver that certainty and knowledge that's like, you can't dismiss these as anecdotes, right? These aren't just stories of communities. These are real facts that we can bring to the table, that are much harder to dispute. And so part of that process was sequencing, finding a grant to be able to afford to do such a massive project. And so that whole process, I don't even know how long it took, but it took a few years. Yeah. It's been a while. I certainly have had 3 jobs in the meantime. But that process of trying to analyze and feed back to the community while also building out the plane as we're flying it.
Yeah. I mean, so I think what I'm getting at is something that Gary talked about, how this kind of work hasn't really traditionally been done in the academy. And, across the country, we do have this sort of town and gown divide. And part of the work of this project was breaking down those divisions, and the sort of length of time that you really took into building the relationships, I think, is really an important thing that I hope more projects get done this way, and I hope become a model. I know you're saying that these protocols might not be the way forward, but I think where you're going is just really important. Some of the things that we're finding just across public safety in general is, we talked about the criminal justice data just a few months ago. Could have been weeks, I don't know anymore. And, there's this real disconnect between the data that we're collecting and the knowledge on the ground. And you see that in the public discourse right now. So I think what you're doing with housing, especially considering that housing is that sort of foundation for all of the public policy issues that we think about and want to make better. So housing is this really foundational part of it. So I just want to stress how long it was, the relationship building. I just really feel like that's the biggest part of the work that you've done is it's important in trust. It's important to take the stories of communities, but also give them the data. I'm just really impressed by how much you've done. Sean, you want to say something?
I was just going to say, you mentioned it, Aubrey. I think an extension of ourselves, an extension of this project was also the undergrads, and that team of undergrads. And I think all of us on this team also took sort of that charge seriously as well. Not only our responsibility to the community, but also our responsibility pedagogically to our students, right? To undergrads and how they sort of entered into the community. And so we had sort of put in some time to build those trusts and build those relationships. But how can you sort of communicate that and train students so that they're ready to not only speak to the project, but also speak to the sensitivities and sort of the intimate details that people were sharing. And so that was something that was really important to us as well, sort of taking our time with the students too. And so we had 2 full days of training. Then the students each took an iPad home and they had to interview, someone that they knew, that they did have that sort of relationship and trust with to sort of test that out. Then we took them into the field and we piloted it as well so they could have a chance to really experience that and see what it was like in the field. So, the roll-up was slow to get them out there, but I think the most important part was a debrief that we did at the end of each day. And so, we were taking students in the cars with us or ordering a Lyft or Uber or whatever to get them to where we needed to go. But before we sort of returned to the university every day, after surveying, we check in with one another. What worked today? What didn't work? Did you ask a question this way? Or what did you learn that you had no idea of? Because I think the sort of town and gown division is something we talk about a lot at the university and as teachers. And it's important to get students out into the community, but do so in a way that is beneficial to the community, that is a public good, and that also the students feel comfortable, empowered, and they have those cultural competency skills to do that in a respectful way. And so that was really big as well. And sort of taking the time to do that training so that our team was ready. And that team, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe was upwards of 40 students or so. So it was pretty large. We had 2 sort of sets of groups, and they were all wonderful. And while we can't name them all individually, really this project couldn't have been done without them. And all the relationships that they built along the way, all those doors and conversations that they had on front porches, in people's living rooms, coming out an upstairs window, it was really a special experience to sort of see that and to be a part of it. And just to spend time and share space, I think, goes a long way. And it's important to mention that as well, both for ourselves and for the students and sort of those experiences that stemmed from that.
See, now I'm getting all excited about all of these different ripples that this one project can do in multiple communities. So thank you for sharing that. Before COVID, we were planning to do an in-depth series on this project and actually talk to the undergrads. Do you have anything that you can share about their experience?
I wanted to jump in first to say that talk about our choice of doing it in person. That was a very deliberate choice. And actually, we talked to other researchers that just could not believe that we were going to try to undertake this project of in-person surveys across these 2 areas in Los Angeles. They thought we were crazy. They thought they were looking forward to see if we could achieve it. Normally, these types of surveys go out in mailers with some money attached if you reply back, and they send like a larger amounts of money for you to, but we really didn't want to bias the sample in terms of the type of people that can answer or are willing to answer by mail. And a bit like Sean was saying, this was an amazing opportunity for all of us, but also for our undergraduate student surveyors. People were opening their homes to us. a lot of them were letting us in. Some were talking to us on the porch, on the front lawn, but they were telling us their stories. And we did try, we had to have a standardized survey, so we had to try to cut all those parts, but it was people opening up, letting you in, seeing, and honestly, like, I think, and that was part of the debrief at the end of the day with the surveyors. Just a lot of them was really eye-opening to see how all these people are living, how everybody's just really trying to live day by day and trying to get by. And all the different types of families they saw a grandmother with her daughter, her boyfriend, 3 kids, all in one studio or a space, because that's, one of them had lost her job, and that's all they could afford at the moment. And then others that would see something completely different, and that would be part of the debrief by the end of the day. And I think that's a big takeaway of trying of coloring all these stories of all the statistics we see around. It's hard for us to put that in the report and tell those stories, but for us personally, I think it was an incredible experience in that way.
Yeah, and to kind of add to that and to your original question too, Aubrey, this wasn't a perfect project, but we really did try to build in equity and inclusion models in all dimensions of our work, from the pedagogy to how we approach community engagement. And USC has a complicated relationship with its community and the neighbors surrounding it. And it was so powerful to see students who'd never been to Koreatown, or who'd never really walked around their neighborhood and felt, oh, it's not for me. And where are the places that are for them? And it can feel spaces can feel so segregated around USC and around the LA area. And so to see people having conversations with their neighbors and to have it, to watch the undergrads really learn so much. I went to Cal and I had a side job lobbying that ended up taking up more time than my classes. And, those experiences out of the classroom taught me just as much as in the classroom, and they really supplemented my learning. And so to see all of these students, some of whom are urban studies students, some of whom are theater or from across the university, just understanding a lot more about, their neighbors as people. And to watch that, I think some of the things we see happening in our nation right now is we've forgotten that our neighbors are humans. We've forgotten that our spaces are public and they're communal and what that means. And so to be able to have conversations like that, to be able to watch them grow in that way, I think was super rewarding. But I think it also just speaks to that question of how we build cities that include people, right? And where change can include everyone. And then the other additional pedagogical objectives that we had, like Sean said, when we were debriefing of why did you ask the survey this way? Why did you do these things? To help them understand how we build evidence and knowledge, which is, again, just a super important thing that we need to be teaching our undergrads and graduate students these days. It was fun.
Good.
Very cute.
That is wonderful. I love engaging the undergrads, and that is the very sad part about this particular year under COVID. So now I'm sort of going back to what you found, but did you feel a sense of urgency when COVID struck? Because you had completed this project, and that the findings that you have are pre-COVID, and the numbers of rent burden are staggering. So, did you feel a sense of urgency about COVID, and how did you want to interact with this project and the fact that we're in a pandemic?
Aubrey, one thought that, I can speak for myself, and I'm sure some of these thoughts are shared by my colleagues, but if until we could really understand how precarious, kind of the sets of choices people had were pre-COVID, we couldn't even begin to, in some sense, fathom what were the choices going to be after people lost jobs. So we were in a time when the economy was as good as it had been for many years.
Yeah.
And in that moment, we're seeing, over half the pop group of people that we surveyed saying, I'm going without food so I could pay the rent. That's staggering and really needs to hit home. And so if you're thinking about, wow, okay, now people are losing their jobs, and some of our populations were eligible for the CARES Act supplements, and so they were going to be okay, quote unquote, for a few months. But now we know that supplement was never renewed. That was July 31st, the last time people received those resources. We've now had many months. And so, it's not a surprise at all, given that people were, going without food to begin with to pay the rent. The people are, lining up in ways that it seems like our policy community are kind of like shocked that so many people are lining up for food. Well, people were already going without food before to pay the rent. And so it shouldn't at all be shocking. We needed to, I guess this is the kind of work that can help establish that deep need that people had, that then now during the pandemic, you can say, we actually have to address these education issues, these food insecurity issues in ways, and then think about as well how to stabilize people in their places. Because if that doesn't happen, then people are always going to be shifting between what bill do I pay first? What do I pay second? What am I going to go without? And as we saw, people were going without a large, not just food, but they're not investing in normal ways that we would, expect people to for their kids' education, and, not wearing clothing that they may want to purchase. So those kinds of those moments. And I think what that certainly inspired as well, I worked with colleagues at the Equity Research Institute Manuel Pastor leads, that most people who are going to listen to the podcast will know of. And so we contributed to a report called No Going Back. And ultimately we worked with colleagues at UCLA in that work to kind of realize that where we were pre-pandemic was not tenable. And so to that end, we have to establish kind of really deeply where we were so that we can not have a target of, well, after we get past the pandemic, we can go back to quote unquote normal. That wasn't tenable. So instead, we need to actually chart out a new path. And so I think in very much the same way that work kind of really highlighted where we were, what were the structural inequities that were causing households that we surveyed to express the insecurity that they expressed. Now we can, with these data, speak to where we don't want to go and to address and to envision a system where there is more equity for people who are our neighbors.
I would add an example from the survey that we asked families if they could cover a hypothetical expense of $400. And we added this question because we know that relatively small unexpected expenses, for example, replacing a broken appliance, a car repair, anything of that, or a couple sick days off work, they can cause a lot of distress to renters without enough savings or income streams. And honestly, that's what we're expecting, or we've expected this pandemic to have caused at least a $400 expense to most of these families, right? Mm-hmm. And we found that actually 1 in 5 of the surveyed families reported that they could not cover that expense if it came. And that goes higher among rent burden families. It goes up to 23% of rent burden families would not be able to, 8% of non-rent burden families. And another way of explaining why this is so important is that according to the 2020 homeless count, 59% of newly homeless individuals report economic hardship as their main reason for becoming homeless. So 59% report that, and 39% report weakened social networks, which also with the pandemic, we're likely to expect. So I would say definitely the COVID pandemic has put a lot of urgency on us with this survey. And as Gary said, to show what this pandemic conditions were that really were untenable before. Like we can't even imagine right now. Unfortunately, we can't go house to house now to do that. At some point, that would be ideal. But yeah.
Yeah. So what should we do moving forward? What are some of the findings, suggestions that you have for making better policy?
Well, we have a lot of ideas. And so happy to share them with you because I think at the end of the day, doing this survey, the numbers are people. And there are people who asked us, if I complete the survey, will my rent go down? Or I can't feed my family. And so it really does provide like this pressing need. So I think one, we need to treat this as a crisis. So I'll speak to maybe the broader, the takeaways here. Stable, safe and affordable housing is just absolutely essential to people's welfare and their well-being. And so we need to treat this as a crisis. And we need to remember that the evictions crisis that's happening now is deeply important, but we can't just target policies like what Gary was saying to going back to the pre-pandemic norm. We really have to think about how do we treat this in a comprehensive way to stabilize renters through the pandemic, but also to get at these issues, these longstanding issues that we have in the rental market that make it so difficult to afford rent, and that makes it so difficult to stay in your neighborhood and with your community. And so thinking really broadly about housing strategies, which I'm sure Gary would be happy to talk about more, but also understanding that, like Soledad was saying, your vulnerability to an economic shock is so foundational to your housing stability, which we know matters for all sorts of reasons, from the schools your kids can attend to being able to have neighbors that you can rely upon. So thinking about health policy, thinking about all of these different policies, these supportive, rebuilding a social safety net is in itself really crucial to helping people stay in safe, affordable, and stable housing. We'll start there.
I'll just say, I mean, again, there are a large list, but we've actually even seen some of the interventions, because of the pandemic, which, was the public health crisis led to an economic crisis. We've actually seen already to be effective. And so I think getting to this idea that, it really is true that if people are paying more than 30% of their income as rent, they are going without significant, just what most people would say is like, well, you need to have enough food. You need to have the ability to provide, school resources for your kids, whether that's books or backpacks or whatever those kinds of things might be. And that families who are above that threshold simply are going without, they are cutting back. And so the other thing we know is that our housing policy infrastructure is such that only 1 in 4 nationally people who are eligible for a housing choice voucher, which would keep them at that 30% threshold, actually receive it. And the Biden administration's kind of housing plan, I think, has picked up on that, and that's kind of a high goal to try to achieve. And actually, that's not a complicated goal to achieve. That's one where if you just quadrupled the funding, then you would be there. Mayor Garcetti actually mentioned at one of our events at USC, our event focusing on the unhoused population that the Price Center did with Schwarzenegger Institute. He said that it was 1 in 8 that are eligible in Los Angeles actually receive a housing choice voucher. In part, that may be because some people are ineligible because of their immigration status. Part, it could be because we're acutely unaffordable relative to other parts of the country. But what it says is that we actually, and I should say that what we've seen in the crisis is that when those CARES Act supplement dollars went into people's hands, they actually were able to maintain being current on their rent. They did not accumulate back rent. And so we actually see that, having in some sense, an insurance mechanism for people that you can actually know that you're not going to fall, so where you're going to be required this month because your income falls or you lose a part-time job to pay 60 or 70% of your income as rent. But you actually have this kind of automatic stabilizer. The pandemic CARES Act was like pandemic insurance. It was just too short. right? It showed that if you're told to stay at home, you actually need to kind of cash in that insurance policy. And that's the role of the federal government there, is to create that, because you wouldn't see that in private markets. So I think what we're seeing is that, if it's not giving people money that in some sense or another is not going to a specific, I guess, social and community end. I mean, what we know is it actually does change the trajectories of people's lives. We know from a lot of research on homelessness that if you can prevent acute insecurity, it's much less expensive than actually, serving someone who's become homeless, serving a family that's become homeless. But that's the wrong reason to do this, right? Is to create an ecosystem where people actually have more stability broadly. And that's where the emerging research on kind of even regional impacts is showing, is that having more stable families, households, actually has benefits to long-term economic growth. Again, what we kind of generated, one of the reasons for the study is we didn't know the mechanisms that were happening at the individual family level. This report's going to highlight what some of those mechanisms are within the household and family. But we have questions in the survey that we haven't yet had time to analyze that are going to be able to speak to what are the strains on the networks that people are embedded in. And if some families, households have different networks or better networks, you can see that that might actually help them. But at the same time, if everyone in the network is experiencing the same stresses, it actually, could make things worse. It could actually multiply the negative effects or negative shocks that people might be experiencing. So I think that fundamentally the evidence is becoming overwhelming, that how to get there is an open question. I might say, why don't we just make sure that people who are paying more than half their income as rent don't have to do that anymore? Let's start there and see what happens, right? And I think you might get more agreement than jumping to the 30%. I don't know what the right path forward is there, but if we can't at least start with, we can't have people paying more than half their income as rent. That's just untenable. And that's going to be a combination of providing what economists like myself would call demand side supports, but also addressing the supply shortage that we have just for median rent housing. We're not building that in California. That's a whole nother conversation for another day. But I think what we've seen in this study is that those supports are actually critical to stabilize communities, households, and families, and those will have long-term regional impacts.
Is there something that we haven't gotten to that you think is really important that we should share before we go? Giovanna, can you start?
I'd like to pass it to Sean and Soledad to make sure that they that there's anything that they want to say, but otherwise, reach out to us if there are any ways in which we can be more practically useful. I think we're all really committed to doing what we can. And the one thing I'll say is, we have solutions that work. We know how to address a lot of these problems. It just comes down to having that political support and the political will to do this. I'll leave it there.
And political support means community support. And that's really important. Sean, Soledad?
I would just offer, I really appreciated what Giovanna and Gary shared in terms of solutions sort of at the macro level, right? We need to increase the availability of affordable homes. We need to sort of have income supplements and guarantee that. I also think that there's a lot of policies on the local level, right, that we can be talking about too. And again, a long list, but just thinking of a couple that are, for example, working their way through the council right now, which is like an anti-harassment ordinance against landlords, right? A right to counsel for folks that are facing eviction. Clear sort of accountability processes in place that if I do have a complaint, that residents know where they can turn to and where they can go for help, and make sure that there's going to be support there. And so that's sort of one aspect, thinking about the power dynamic. And then the other thing I think that this study reveals is that often we talk about rent and we talk about income, but there's all these other expenses, right? And those are other opportunities for interventions, right? So if we think about expanding Medicaid, right, or making community health centers more accessible, right, that's going to increase the disposable income, the residual income that people have left over for housing, right? If we make food banks more accessible, right, that's another expense. If we think about ways to strengthen our educational institutions so that parents don't have to spend as much money at home, right, so there's the supplemental programs. So I think it's time as well that we get creative in the solutions that we're thinking about, and we can also get specific and think about the ways that these things interact with one another, and that can open up new possibilities of policies that maybe we haven't associated as readily with housing before, that can get us sort of steps to where we want to go, right? It's not going to be the silver bullet, but it's going to make, again, that daily life more livable, allowing people to thrive in the day-to-day, which I think does have impact as one we need to keep in mind as we're talking about sort of these larger, more structural interventions that we could do as well.
I think most has been said, but really just highlight to not forget the people we're really talking about. It's easy to get lost in the numbers on these conversations, especially with the pandemic. Numbers are so large. But yeah, to not lose sight of all these individual stories and people, and like how this is really affecting families.
Just kind of one other thought that it wasn't uplifted directly in the report, but it was somewhat implicit in one of the things that Sean said earlier about how immigrant households were on some level able to maintain the same level of trade-offs because they made a set of choices in order to get them to the point where they could live in that place, engage in that community, in that neighborhood, but yet face, again, the same sorts of choices, but with more people in smaller units. And I think it's worth saying that maybe there's a set of policies that aren't as useful as people have thought for populations in high poverty communities. And I often hear the idea of, well, we need more financial education and literacy as a policy prescription, for people who are poor or near poor. It turns out, if you really think about what we've uncovered in the data, these families are better at keeping and maintaining a budget than most middle class and high income families. They are living on the margins, and they're making strategic, critical choices so that they can provide the best they can for their families. It doesn't mean that understanding access to certain kind of financial instruments and those kinds of things would not be helpful. But, kind of the approach of, if we just help poor people with financial literacy as if they don't actually know how to keep a budget is just false. Right. We saw in the 800, household surveys that these folks are making these really almost, we should say, tragic choices, and they're doing it because they actually know really well how to keep a budget. And so we should actually leverage that. And that's why we can trust families who are really good at managing financial resources, as the families in our survey were, with actually providing them more stability as it relates to, housing subsidies, et cetera. So I think in that way, like I said, it's not one of the highlight findings from the study, but it's just something that we saw happening with people, that people are actually really good at budgeting. And I think to that end, it changes sometimes policy narratives around who our neighbors are, what their strengths are, and what the opportunities are as we could move forward toward a better future together.
I love that. And it also highlights some of our implicit biases that we have. And that's really important. And so I was just thinking, as you were talking, that just little policies like fee-free banking, so that people don't need to go to money lenders to cash checks, banking available for immigrants as well, where they don't have to have a U.S. driver's license and that sort of thing. All of those things are connected. And I think the important thing about this project is how you're really identifying that and highlighting all of those connections, and building these relationships with the community so that as you're doing further research, it's doing it together, which is exactly what you just said, Gary, which I think going back to what Giovanna said, this interconnectedness, actually you've all said it. So the interconnectedness of all the policies, but the people, and that even though we might be separated, we are all part of the same community. And that when we're facing an eviction crisis, it's going to affect regional, it's going to affect, Hollywood, it's going to affect all the things. And this is a really, it's not just Los Angeles, this is all over the country. I mean, we've just seen the food lines in El Paso. So this is all over the country. And this is data to get us started thinking about moving forward. So unless anyone has anything else to add, go ahead, Joanna.
Just one thing, we would be remiss if we didn't thank the Haynes Foundation for funding our survey, the Lusk Center for Real Estate for funding various parts of the project, supplemental funding, and then just want to particularly thank the Price Center for Social Innovation, which gave us so many different resources from financial to emotional, logistical, everything. What you were saying earlier about it being so difficult to do this work, one of the reasons we were able to do this work is because we had partners like Gary who understood that timelines and support doesn't always match up to everything. So they gave us the space to do this work. So I just want to say thank you so much.
Thank you. Who do you want to read the report, and where is the report living?
Well, the report's going to be living on the Price Center website. We have created a page that focuses on issues of rent burden and housing instability. And so we certainly want everyone to read it. I think that we are trying to help the people who are engaged in organizing in communities, provide them with information to be more effective at advocating for change that they see in their community. That certainly, we want people who are participated in the report to read and comment and evaluate what we've done. We certainly want people in city councils, county board of supervisors to read the report so that they can actually shape policies. We have a moment, with Measure J, for those people who live in LA County, where we've committed in our discretionary part of the budget that 10% of those resources are going to be focused on, a broad range of issues, but one of those sets of issues has to do with improving housing stability. So now we have a moment where we can actually start talking about what are the kinds of things we could do to improve housing stability. And I think the data here suggests kind of the deep precarity that people had when the economy was good. Now, as we're moving forward, we need to actually speak to what does it mean to stabilize people in their homes. And Sean listed a number of those policies. Soledad and Giovanna did as well. So I want, those communities to read it. Then I, of course, as a professor, want the academic, community to read it as well. Not only to help fill the gap in knowledge, but also to appreciate how the process of research can uncover different kinds of findings than perhaps other processes of research. And as I said, we're trying to innovate around those processes of research as well, processes of social change. And as I said, we don't have the model yet. We're trying to understand and uncover what those models are of participatory research. We're not the only ones in the country, obviously, doing that. There's many people who have done, kind of laid the groundwork on that. But we're excited to be part of that. And I think that we have the chance to have more people read the report because we've been talking to stakeholders who are in policy and also people in the community.
Great. And nonprofit and community activists should reach out because this is an ongoing project. This is just the preliminary results and you've got a lot to dig into. Is there a place, is there a next step for you in this project? Sean is definitely doing some work.
Lots of next steps. Like the sort of folks have spoken to as well. I think what was so exciting for this was, at least this first sort of report, was this was the first time that we had all the data. We were able to sort of pop the hood off and really sort of begin to dig around, but it really is just a beginning. There's just a lot there. This focused on the consumption trade-offs, but sort of other themes that we talked about was folks' experiences with their neighborhoods, the developments that had been going in, and sort of their viewpoints on it. We did an extensive housing history. So each unit a family and household had lived in for the past 2 years, as well as their work schedule or their work during their time, that income. So we can sort of trace that back and see how fluctuations over sort of the last few years have changed things. We also spoke to people about the support that they have, right? And the ways that they are accessing resources or unable to access resources to get at some of those policy solutions. So I think, many papers that look at sort of the intersection of those things, right? How these different behaviors and how these different changes impact public health or impact health, right? How that impacts folks' outlook in terms of their ability to stay, how that impacted sort of the adjustments they made. So that's all to come. And then speaking for myself personally, we have reports coming out about the focus groups as well that we're still sort of churning out. And really, I think the biggest thing that I'm looking forward to on the horizon is how we continue to get this work out there, engage the public, like Gary mentioned, engage council members, engage politicians, engage community members, and begin to have this, using this as a gesture, a starting off point to have the conversations needed to have to figure out, what do we do next, right? How do we not go back to where we were pre-COVID, and how do we begin to get real, right? And get serious about creating stability for tenants in the city. So that was a bit unwieldy answer, but I'm sure other folks have thoughts too, but I think there's lots of good stuff to come in. I'm really looking forward to continue collaborating with, everyone here in this Zoom room today, and think we got a lot of good work still to go.
Excellent. Thank you. Go ahead, Gary.
I was just going to say that it's, in many ways, the genesis of this work not only was from identifying gaps in the academic literature and what we know, but also from the demands and passions of people who are working in the community, whether they were organized in a collective impact structure like the Promise Zones or individual organizations that have long, decades history here in LA. And so I actually, in some ways, as Sean noted, we have lots of academic papers that can come up from this very rich data, and that will certainly be part of this. But we need to also reconnect to our partners that help generate the ideas for this work to begin with, to know what is it, has something shifted for them? And so in thinking about next steps with our research agenda around how can we improve housing and stability for people in metro areas, ex-urban areas, et cetera, I don't know what ideas are going to come from our community partners, and we need to be ready to act in partnership with them so that we can uncover the kinds of pieces of research and understanding and data that can actually align with a process of change that moves us to a point, as in this context, where people are stably housed.
Well, I actually feel hopeful for the first time in a really long time. So thank you all for this. Thank you for joining me today. And I am looking forward to reading all of the things and seeing where this project goes. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Aubrey.